Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today we are going to be talking about King Arthur and the Legend of the Holy Grail. And we're going to be doing that in the context of the hero's journey. So on the one hand, we're examining this as another example of the hero's journey that takes things a little bit of a different direction from what we saw with Gilgamesh. On the other hand, it's also just an excuse to talk about some great stories because that's part of what we want to do in this class after all. And the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table at Camelot and the quests, the various quests for the Holy Grail and all sorts of different quests that the knights went on. They're all really great stories. So I wanted to take some time to take a look at them and incorporate them into our understanding of mythology, of myths and legends and stories. But I think they will illustrate some interesting things as well, because they're very connected to this idea of the heroic journey. Because what did these knights do? They go on heroic quests. Joseph Campbell, one of his areas of expertise was in the legend of King Arthur and these heroic stories of these knights. That was something he had studied specifically, actually. So he was able to draw on it quite a bit. And you see a lot of discussion of the Holy Grail and what it means and what it symbolizes and the different stories throughout his work. So I'm going to be drawing on that throughout here. But we'll just take a look at some of the different knights, the different stories, and different ideas, and how that connects back to Campbell's ideas of the hero's journey. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. But first off, we should probably establish, what is this basic story of King Arthur? Who is King Arthur? Well, the standard story of King Arthur is that he was a great king of Britain who led the Knights of the Round Table from his castle at Camelot, and he led them and inspired them to do great and heroic quests, to do holy deeds and find sacred relics. Now, these stories emerged during the medieval period, probably first starting around the 1100s. And in that time period, people were very interested in relics, you know, finding things that were associated with Jesus or with saints and things like that, and bringing them back so that people could have some sort of holiness from the holy power that was stored in these relics, be a little bit closer to God by finding something that was itself kind of close to someone who was close to God, if you know what I mean. So there was a real interest in this idea of going off and finding holy things. And originally, the earliest King Arthur stories seem to be based on a king who defended Britain from invaders. So this was back in the time of the really early, end of the Roman Empire, start of Britain being its own independent thing, that type of time. And this was around the 500s to 600s is when these stories were thought to have originally taken place. So they were based on the idea of a king who lived around that time period, this Arthur or Arturius or something like that. And he was either British or Welsh. It depends on whether you ask the British or the Welsh. And he defended Britain from outsiders, the Saxons. And probably, this may or may not be a real person. Probably not. But there were Saxon invasions, there were battles between local kings and outsiders during this time period. So this is probably what we refer to as a legend, something that has a grain of truth in it, a myth that is based on some amount of history or fact. But we have to remember that probably not 100% based on history or fact. Probably wasn't a King Arthur. If there was, he probably wasn't quite the guy that we imagine him. For one thing, the people who were telling his story were projecting a lot from their own time period. Holy relics weren't really a concern to people in the 500s, 600s. They were much more a concern of the 1100s. But, they like to have this idea that there was this ancient king who had been this great leader who is now lost to the world. And that's, in a way, a kind of classic golden age type of story that, once upon a time there was this great king, but we don't see kings as great as him anymore. So that's the core of it. And this was a story that was told over and over and over again. And we're lucky enough to have a lot of different versions of it. Throughout the 1100s and onward, lots of different people set the story down in lots of different ways. And they can differ quite widely. In some, this is how King Arthur dies, and in others, he dies in a completely different way. And even whole characters can appear and disappear. But there are some big ideas that have become influential in our culture and probably the most well-known parts of the myth. Some of the different versions, the very first we see is Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1138, but it was probably a story that people were telling orally even before then, which isn't that always the way with these types of things. The one I had you guys read from the book is, the book has a few different ones of these, but we particularly focused on the work of, I'm going to butcher this, Chrétien de Troyes, who was the first to clearly place the idea of the Holy Grail in the story, to use the words Grail. So he's very influential. Another one who's really influential is Thomas Malory, who wrote Le Mort d'Arthur, Death of Arthur. So the whole story of King Arthur's life and death is probably the number one that people go back to the most in telling the story. And he was basing his work on a lot of other people who had come before him and kind of doing like a greatest hits collection. But another influential one from modern times is the book The Once and Future King, which was the inspiration for Disney's movie The Sword and the Stone. So that's pretty cool. So there's a lot of different takes on King Arthur, and he's undergone a resurgence in popularity since the 1400s. So good for him. But the big sort of theme of the legend of King Arthur is that he's this great king, but also all the knights under him are these great, significant, heroic figures. He's like a leader of all of them around their round table, which is round because no one is supposed to be more important than anyone else at that table. They're all supposed to be equal. So, you know, there's not like a head of the table. They're all around the circle, and that makes it more fair. And so this is sort of like a first among equals type of idea, and the idea of these sort of all these different heroes are working together, and yet they also still go on their individual quests. They're all bringing glory to his kingdom of Camelot, but they're all kind of doing their own thing at the same time. So this is a really great framework for studying hero stories, and we'll find that a lot of these stories of these knights fit into a heroic framework, especially when you look at the beginning. Now, I also want to talk about the Holy Grail, which is kind of the ultimate version of a heroic quest. The Holy Grail, we may know it as a goblet. Maybe we've seen the Indiana Jones movie of, you know, the cup. That is the cup that was, associated with Jesus at the Last Supper. But originally, this is the weird thing, the Grail was not necessarily a cup. Originally the word Grail means something like, it can mean something like a serving plate or a tray of food or something like that, in addition to a cup. It can be anything that people eat and drink from. In some versions of the story, it's even a stone which just magically produces food. So the kind of core idea of the Grail, I think originally, is that it gives you food and drink forever, because it's a relic that comes from God, and it has this holy power. It has the ultimate holy power, you might say. And the stories around it are many. One of them is that it held Jesus's blood from the cross. A guy named Joseph of Arimathea took the goblet, took the cup, and caught Jesus's blood, and that gave it this holy power. But also some stories, and this is another case where we have kind of a merging of stories. Some stories say that it was originally the cup that was at the Last Supper that Jesus drank from when he had the disciples take communion together. So it had Jesus's blood and it had the wine at the first communion. So there's a lot going on here with the Holy Grail. And it has this strong power of God. But originally, it seems to have just been this legend or this myth of a holy relic that could grant you infinite food and drink. And then later on, it gets associated with all these stories. One story says that it was carried by the neutral angels, angels who were neither good nor evil. They hadn't fallen, but they weren't up in heaven with God. They were just kind of wandering around, and they carried the Holy Grail to the earth, which is interesting and weird, and sort of suggests that the Grail is beyond good and evil in some way, or that, it's outside of the normal order of things. Campbell talks about this as well. He says, he quotes one of the authors as saying, one of the authors of these King Arthur stories as saying at the beginning, no one knows what their actions will be for good or for evil. Every act has both good and evil results. Every act in life yields pairs of opposites in its results. The best we can do is lean towards the light. This is what the Grail is about, according to Joseph Campbell. And if we're thinking about his framework for understanding myths, what are we going to say that the Grail is? What kind of thing from his ideas does it fit? I think we have to say it's an elixir, right? And I think it's the ultimate elixir. It's this symbol which is associated with divine power, which is usually a symbol of the energies of life. And it gives food and drink, which are also the energies of life. So that's pretty important. There's some different stories about where to find the Holy Grail. One is about this fellow called the Fisher King. The Fisher King is a king who is not really fully performing the duty of being king. And because of that, his kingdom suffers. He is not really up to it because when he was a young man guarding the Grail, he went and he got in a fight. It was actually with his half brother who was a Muslim. So that's a pretty big set of ideas right there. The Muslim knight wounded him in the groin or in the upper leg. And he was unable to be a good king after that. And so one idea about the Holy Grail is that you must find the castle of the Grail King or the Fisher King. He's also called the Fisher King because he spends a lot of his time fishing because he can't really do anything else. The other big story about the Holy Grail is the story of Joseph of Arimathea, which is the guy that in some stories is guarding the Grail because he's the guy who found the Grail in the first place. He took the cup from the Last Supper and he caught Jesus's blood in the cup. So he is kind of this immortal saint who has been living all this time guarding the Grail. Those are some of the stories around the Grail anyway. And there's actually a lot more variation than even we're going to go into here. If the Grail is a stone or a serving plate, that leads to different stories. But just know that it has a wide variety of things. And the Grail is a really good example of letting us look at what Joseph Campbell's idea of an elixir actually is. So let me, I'm looking through the book here. Let's see. Okay, so there's a lot to dig into here, but I'm going to try and summarize a little bit and skip a few words. Let's see. But first, I have to find the right page, so bear with me. There is one theory that the Holy Grail represented the center of perfect harmony, the search for perfection, for totality and unity. There are a number of sources for the Holy Grail. One is that there is a cauldron of plenty in the mansion of the god of the sea, down in the depths of the unconscious. It is out of the depths of the unconscious that the energies of life come to us. This cauldron is the inexhaustible source, the center, the bubbling spring from which all life proceeds. And this is from his video series, The Power of Myth. Also the book, which records the lectures. And actually, these are interviews, so there's some back and forth here. Do you think this is the unconscious? Not only the unconscious, but also the world. Things are coming to life around you all the time. There's a life pouring into the world, and it pours from an inexhaustible source. And he goes on to say, that's the inexhaustible center that is represented by the Grail. When life comes into being, it is neither afraid nor desiring. It is just becoming. Then it gets into being, and it begins to be afraid and desiring. When you can get rid of fear and desire and just get back to where you're becoming, you've hit the spot. The goal of your quest for knowledge of yourself is to be found at that burning point in yourself, that becoming thing in yourself, which is innocent of the goods and evils of the world, and therefore desireless and fearless. That is the condition of a warrior going into battle with perfect courage. That's the sense of the energy of the center. That's the meaning of this image of the Grail, the inexhaustible fountain of the source. The source doesn't care what happens once it gives into being. It's the giving and coming into being that counts, and that's the becoming life point in you. That's what all these myths are concerned to tell you. So that's interesting. He says basically it's life pouring forward, and it's where, it's a symbol of all this sort of energy pouring into the universe. So there's quite a lot to think about there. But let's leave the Joseph Campbell book for a second, and let's talk about some of these different characters in the story. And maybe we'll start to see how they fit into the story of the Holy Grail and how they fit into Joseph Campbell's framework of heroes and their quests. So let's start, of course, with King Arthur himself. So his life really does have an element of a hero's journey to it. Now, the original myths, the earliest Arthur myths seem to be something about him being a monster slayer, a great hero who would, fight dragons and monsters and demons and things like that, which is a theme that we see in, a lot of European mythology back in the day. But as time goes on, he takes on a more defined purpose. So King Arthur grows up not knowing that he is a king. He is a bastard son. He is the secret son of King Uther Pendragon. Uther Pendragon, whose name means something like the Dragon Commander or the Dragon King. And this king, he actually either had to hide his son away or he had an affair. And so King Arthur is the bastard heir to the throne who was hidden away for his own safety. So Arthur doesn't know he's a king. He has absolutely no idea until one day a stone appears in the churchyard, and there's a sword in that stone. And Merlin the wizard prophesizes that whoever can pull that sword out of the stone will be the true king. And Merlin, actually, a big part of what he does is gives prophecies like this. Now, in some versions of this story, the sword is Excalibur. In other versions of the story, Excalibur is a different sword. But in either case, King Arthur pulls the sword out of the stone, and maybe in some versions not even realizing that that's what he's doing. But he pulls the sword out of the stone, and that is a recognition. He is in a different role now, and he is the new king. And so that is the kind of thing you see in a lot of hero stories, is something comes along to make the hero be recognized. And very often that's the call to adventure, that this hero is meant for a special purpose, has a special destiny. So King Arthur fits that pattern very well. He goes on to have adventures and many quests. He, as I said, defends against invaders, and he creates the Knights of the Round Table to go on quests together. And in some versions of the story, he picks up Excalibur separately from a mysterious feminine entity called the Lady of the Lake. So that could be a meeting with the goddess in some fashion. So Arthur goes on all these quests, and those are, could be his road of trials. And, it culminates in him being this great king who will be remembered forever. Except there are some problems for him, to put it mildly. And this is a theme we're going to see with all of these characters pretty much, is that, like his father, King Arthur has an affair. And this it leads to the breakdown of his kingdom, ultimately. And there's a lot of different versions of this story, but one of the versions of the story is that the woman he has an affair with is his own half-sister, Morgause. And Morgause is, sometimes depicted as evil, sometimes depicted as, they both were mutually responsible, Arthur and Morgause, for committing the sin of incest. So he's committed adultery and incest. So that's not good. And the consequences are going to come back to haunt him, because there's a son that is born of this situation. And the son grows up. His name is Mordred, and he comes back, and he challenges Arthur, and he slays him. And he ends up, in various ways, destroying the Knights of the Round Table. So this great glorious age of heroes doing great things and great deeds, it comes to an end because of Arthur's son, because of the next generation, but also because of Arthur's own mistakes and sins catching up to him. And I have to wonder, how does this fit with the framework of the hero's journey? It seems like you have these heroes, but maybe they're not heroes forever. If heroes are people who have this special role, who have this authority in society because they've gone on adventures and learned, to grow, well, maybe if they haven't grown all the way, their power can fall apart. And maybe as time goes on, we see so many things about generational conflict in these stories. It seems almost a cycle where the old generation gets replaced by the new generation. You could read Mordred's story as being a heroic journey in a way, that he is a young man who doesn't know his father. When he comes to confront his father, he slays him, and he destroys something beautiful, but that is his victory. So there's these patterns here that relate to the hero's journey. And I would say for the characters in the stories of the Knights of the Round Table, it seems like it's after they go on their journey, then it catches up to them. They can do great deeds, but there's still this sort of flawed humanity to them that causes them to make mistakes, that brings them back down from the place of being this hero, this leader, back down to earth, which is an interesting way to approach these patterns. Let's also talk about some other characters. Merlin, we got to talk about Merlin. Merlin is, the wise old wizard. He's the classic wise old wizard. Maybe kind of influenced by Odin and being this old man with a beard who knows all sorts of weird secrets and things. Merlin's two big jobs that he has are prophecies and shapeshifting. He's always predicting the future, but people don't listen to him. Usually he's predicting the future as some kind of downfall for somebody. And that fits again into this theme of the downfall. He's also very good at shape-shifting, and this seems almost like a holdover from more ancient stories of shape-shifting pagan gods and things like that. Interestingly, he's based on one of the first Arthur storytellers. So apparently one of the first people to speak the legend of King Arthur was this bard called Myrddin, who was kind of a wild and crazy prophet as well. He could predict the future, or he claimed to be able to as well. So he was doing two jobs, and he had this wild personality where he was very sort of prophetic and mysterious and magical. So they incorporated him into the story and made him a character, or at least that's what current scholars think. So that's pretty cool, that this would be influenced by the storyteller in some way. Some of the legends that surround Merlin include an idea about him maybe being the child of a demon, that the demon was trying to create this powerful entity, and maybe even the Antichrist, but Merlin had a good mother who raised him to be a good boy, and so he didn't become the Antichrist. And so I kind of think this is maybe dealing with some of the confusion of like incorporating these pagan stories, like are the pagan gods demons or are they okay? And if Merlin is kind of one of them, then how do they reconcile that? That might be one way. But like King Arthur, Merlin is ultimately destroyed by one of his own mistakes. His mistake is, again, having to do with a woman. This is another magical person, the sorceress Morgan Le Fay, or sometimes Morgana. Or sometimes the name is Nimue instead. So there's different characters, but in either case, he is seduced by another sorceress. And some stories say because he had prophecies, he knew it was going to happen, but it ended up happening in such a way that he couldn't escape it. She seduced him, and she used this seduction to either kill him or imprison him. In some stories, they say she imprisoned him under a stone in the mountain, and he's just in there and he hasn't come out. And Morgan, or Nimue, takes over being Arthur's court wizard because she's successfully pulled this con. So it's the sorceress, and it's his relationships with women that ultimately destroy him. Okay, yeah, let's go on a little bit further, and then I'll split the video again. Okay, so one important character to talk about is King Arthur's queen, Guinevere. Now, he wasn't real faithful to her, but to be fair, she wasn't real faithful to him, even though they were supposed to be. And that is sort of one of the tragedies of their stories. And at first, in the early parts of King Arthur's story, Guinevere might seem like a positive interaction with the goddess, right? She's sometimes associated with magic, maybe even fortune telling or prophecy. She's sometimes described as being like a goddess, or having traits that are associated with earlier pagan goddesses from earlier times. So she seems to fit that role of a goddess who Arthur successfully marries, and that's part of his, rise to being the significant hero, the significant leader. But then Guinevere's story goes on to say that she slept with Lancelot. Lancelot being, as we'll discuss in a second, one of King Arthur's right-hand knights, maybe the most right-hand knight. And the stories differ quite a lot. Did she betray Arthur because he betrayed her? Was she sleeping with someone else because he was unfaithful? Or was it the other way around, that he became unfaithful because she became unfaithful? In either case, it doesn't look good for either of them. And so there's a real question about, why would this happen? And is Guinevere good or bad? Some stories describe her as being essentially seduced away from Arthur. Or other stories describe her as kind of diabolical and scheming and, there's a lot more scrutiny towards her than there is towards Arthur, because there's a double standard here. She is the one who is put under the harsher examination. In some stories, when Mordred comes along, she leaves Arthur for Mordred, and that's part of what destroys Camelot. In other versions of the story, she is simply captured and manipulated by Mordred. So there's a lot going on with her, and it's a tragedy that her story, in a lot of ways, seems to revolve exclusively around these relationships with men. But it is kind of about, you know, the limitations of her role. She's the queen, and that's kind of what she's known for. Maybe once upon a time there were goddesses, but now she has this very specific role that she has to play. And ultimately she fails at that role, and that's part of her tragedy, and that's part of Arthur's tragedy. And when we talk about her, we talk about Lancelot, because Lancelot, to be fair, Lancelot comes under a fair bit of criticism here too, because he betrayed his king. He was supposed to be part of this very strict system of loyalty, which is very important in the ancient Middle Ages, the feudal system. The knight swears loyalty to the king, and Lancelot violates that relationship. But before he did that, he was a hero. He had a heroic journey himself. He started off as a young man, not really knowing who he was. In some stories, he was actually raised by the Lady of the Lake outside of society. Then he traveled and he found the knights, and he decided he wanted to become a knight. And he went off to go join the Knights of the Round Table, and he became a dragon slayer, slaying a number of different dragons. He slew monsters and did these great heroic things that made him this noble hero. He succeeded in many quests, but the one quest he couldn't succeed in was the quest for the Holy Grail. He searched and searched, but he could never find it. And that seems to have a lot to do with his sins and his mistakes as a hero. Because after being this great hero, he slept with Guinevere. And that sort of inability to, not give way to temptation seems to be what brought him down and kept him from achieving the Holy Grail. Now, it's at this point that we can talk about a pretty interesting theme here, which is taken in a lot of different directions by a lot of different writers. But this is the theme of what they call courtly romance. So courtly romance is something that we see in a lot of medieval texts. There was a whole sort of movement, an artistic movement, you might say, around it, which is all based around this idea of a knight pledging his loyalty to a lady. Now, the lady in question was almost certainly married at that time. She might be a baroness, she might be a queen like Guinevere. And so Lancelot and Guinevere are playing out this role of the noble knight and the beautiful queen who is looking after him. And the way this interaction between the knight and the lady works is that the knight praises her beauty and says she's very noble and she's very kind and she's very beautiful and she has a great soul and she's close to God and stuff like that. And then the lady gives the noble knight her favor, maybe just like a handkerchief or a ribbon. And he wears the ribbon into battle and is thinking of her when he goes off to do his heroic deeds. That's what Lancelot and Guinevere were doing originally. Now, this relationship is platonic, theoretically. It's very, it's a very loaded relationship. And when you think about women in the Middle Ages not having a whole lot of choice as to who they were going to marry, you could imagine that they would seek some kind of escape. And you could imagine also that a knight would be very interested in getting favors from a powerful baroness or noble lady or queen. And they kept things just on the down low enough to be able to get away with things a lot of the time. But because they kept saying it was platonic, they were able to, in many cases, sort of hide love affairs under this guise, which is pretty mind-blowing, actually, that people were able to get away with it, but they did. And to be fair, it wasn't always about affairs. Sometimes it was just about, a lady likes getting complimented, and a knight likes getting the favors of a lady. And the reason we know about this is in large part because so much poetry and music came out of this tradition. The knight would write poems for the beloved lady saying how great she was. And some authors tried to stress less of the less of the romantic love and more of the platonic love, and say that this relationship between the knight and the lady was beyond sexuality. It was a God-given relationship instead. It was all about their sort of spiritual love for one another. In reality, it was kind of both. So the big question when we get to Lancelot and Guinevere is this an example of this, or is this a parody of courtly romance? Some stories seem to say, be saying like, okay, Lancelot and Guinevere are showing how bad courtly romance is because it's showing the whole thing like falling apart and like people betraying their spouses, right? On the other hand, other authors seem to say that Lancelot and Guinevere are noble. They've expressed something beautiful and spectacular in their relationship here. And this would be, these folks would say that there's a kind of contrast between love versus duty. Your duty to your marriage that you were in all likelihood probably forced into, versus love, the society versus love. This is sort of the theme that's being explored here. And what kind of love is it anyway? With Lancelot and Guinevere, you can take it in either direction, and different writers said it was good or said it was bad. But there are other stories along these lines as well. Some of them kind of associated with King Arthur. There's the story of Tristan and Isolde. So the story of Tristan and Isolde goes something like this. Isolde is a young princess or noble lady, and she is betrothed to the much older King Mark. So King Mark is going to marry her. She's like 20, he's like 40 or older. And then, we don't know how she feels, but it's kind of implied that she doesn't feel great about this. And then one day, his nephew Tristan comes along, and King Mark had obtained a love potion so that she would fall in love with him. But Tristan accidentally drinks the love potion. And then Isolde accidentally drinks the love potion and looks at Tristan. So they look at each other and they fall in love. And so, this is a cute way of saying that the people who were actually the same age fall in love with each other despite what their society, demands of them. And so this has been considered this, noble and romantic story that operas have been made out of, and great works of fiction and stuff. But it seems, like, oh, they didn't really like want to cheat. They just couldn't help it. They drank a love potion. But that's kind of the way that love is in these stories, is that, it's like, can you help it? Can you like really control it? Maybe you can't. And so there's this sort of theme of freedom straining against society that people have seen in the story of Tristan and Isolde. And Joseph Campbell expressed this as, again, this idea of love versus duty. He described it as amor versus Roma. Amor is the Latin word for love, sometimes romantic love, and Roma is the Roman Catholic Church, is this official society that's telling people the way that they should do things. And ultimately, it ends tragically because both end up getting slain. Sometimes it's Mark himself who slays both of them when he finds out. But in Dante's Inferno, Dante meets the two of them, and they're burning in hell. And they say, yeah, it was worth it. It was worth it to do this great sin, even if it led to me going to hell, which is quite a statement. And a lot of authors sometimes make Tristan one of the knights of the Round Table. I don't think he was originally, but it sort of fits this theme, so people connected these stories together. And yeah, so we see this theme of this freedom versus authority. On the one hand, maybe you say that freedom is better, that the freedom to love how you want to love is better, and that Guinevere and Lancelot, they should not be condemned. Maybe they should even be praised. On the other hand, other authors will emphasize that, yeah, this is the sin that destroyed them, and giving into temptation is what seems to destroy pretty much all of the Knights of the Round Table. And so I think these myths have a lot to do with the society evaluating this theme. And this kind of connects to the hero's journey in that the hero is an individual, is someone who goes off to seek to do these individual holy quests. And when we experience this sort of psychological growth, it's as an individual. But every myth is influenced by the society that tells it. Okay, So I'm going to pick up in the next video by talking about the final quest for the Holy Grail and who actually succeeds in the quest for the Holy Grail. And they are going to go about things a little bit differently.